Hey guys, Shane here. So welcome to this post-build video of ASUKA Models Sherman III, kit number 35018. So this is an approximation to my best of my skills of what a Sherman III of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers may have looked like during the Fitman ambush. So the Sherbrooks were one of the two armour regiments that were present and possibly responsible for the death of Michael Fitman, the other being the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, which will be doing one of their vehicles in a later video. So I've done some aftermarket detailing to try to get this vehicle to match the limited resources I could find on Sherbrooke Sherman IIIs. So this vehicle is meant to represent Caribou 3, which was Major Radley Walters' command vehicle, and he was the squadron commander of A Squadron, Sherbrooke Fusiliers, during that engagement. So I've just added a few aftermarket and a few scratch built details to best try to recreate that. So going through some of the limited resources I could find on images of Sherbrooke Shermans, there isn't that many of them from Normandy that I could comfortably identify as Sherbrooke vehicles. Sometimes, especially online, a lot of websites will basically claim they're from one regiment or squadron, in fact they're from another. So I've only found several images, including this vehicle here, which is a Sherman III, which has the similar characteristics of the ASUKA model kit. So these are all Pullman M4A2 or Sherman III in British and Commonwealth nomenclature. So the Pullman Sherman IIIs or M4A2s are the ones with the cast hoods that we're going to get into as we get into looking at the various details. So I only kind of found a few images of various Sherman IIIs, including the very famous Sherman bomb, which is a Sherman III or M4A2 from the Sherbrooks that actually survived the entire length of the war from the moment it landed on Normandy until VE Day. And this is that vehicle there with its crew. However, you can't really see too much, but I thought you'd have to kind of mention that vehicle. So we're going to start off with adding some of the details. So ASUKA Models has a tendency to kind of blend various different Sherman factory features together. However, this vehicle is quite similar and quite faithful to a Pullman Sherman from the Pullman armour factory, if you like. So the first thing that jumps out with the Pullmans is the lovely cast hood on the driver and co-driver positions. So I added some nice cast texturing using Mr. Surfacer. And they also have a cast insert for the bow gun, which is the reason why you can see a strip of cast texturing going down past the bow gunner's position, which we'll see in a bit more detail. So I masked off the areas that I wanted to add the cast texturing to, and then just using some Mr. Surfacer 500, I just applied it with an old brush and then began to stipple each coat. It took about 3 coats just to build up a nice and fine cast texture. You don't want it too thick, so just it's better to work in a few small layers and stippling as you go. And again, you can see those nicely rounded cast driver hoods. The Fisher M4A2s or Sherman IIIs have the more block square edges to their driver and co-driver hoods, so that's an easy way of telling them apart. So if you're doing, say, a Marine Corps M4A2 on Tarawa, you should be using a Fisher upper hull, which has got the more squared hoods. So just after a few coats of Mr. Surfacer, we have some nice cast texturing, and we're ready to start adding more detail to our Sherman. So one of my first go-tos for adding details is to add and replace, should I say, the brush guards, and these are 3D printed pieces by MJ Miniatures. There's different manufacturers that do 3D brush guards for Shermans. These are just one example. I have quite a few of them in stash and they're quite good. And I added some of the missing detail, which is the retaining chain for the headlight plugs. That's what that small cylinder on the side of the brush guards are, and there's a small bit of chain that runs from the top of the plug to the bottom of the retaining cylinder, and that's just a key chain, should I say. So moving to the driver co-driver hatches, so I added some basic detailing here. So I replaced the grab handles with some from my spare bits box. I think this is from a Ming Models Sherman kit, which fit the ASUKA ones just fine. I also replaced the springs for the hatches with some copper wire and added some cast numbering using Archer Fine Transfer's cast numbering set. So a nice little simple detail that I add to my small hatch Shermans is I drill out this semicircular nub here at the back of the hatch mount, and this is actually meant to be the anchor point for the hatch springs. So just very carefully I drill these out just to make them hollow. It's very easy to pop these off, I do it all the time, and then have to replace them with scratch built ones. So once I drill those out and install the hatches, then I'll actually just get some 0.3mm copper wire and spool it around like a 0.3mm drill bit, and that's how I create my springs. They're not perfect, but they're far nicer than using the plastic ones. So I made the decision to make my M4A2 or Sherman III into a command vehicle, as I'm kind of speculating on my part that Major Walter's vehicle was in fact a command vehicle. He's a squadron commander after all. And this is an example of a Sherman III command vehicle, in this case from the 18th Hussars. And you can kind of see the antenna array that's got, obviously the front antenna pot has got a radio mounted on the glacis, as well as the twin radios on the third bustle. Going to our kit part here, I just took a radio mount and glued it into place onto the radio pot, as well as added a very simple cast texture. Again, this is how you can tell it's a Pullman. That shape is very synonymous with Pullman Shermans, so that's another indicator that this is in fact a Pullman Sherman. So just using a little bit of Tamiya extra thin, I just applied it somewhat thickly onto the area I wanted to add a cast texture to. Let it stand for a couple of seconds, and once the plastic is a little bit soft, I just came in with an old brush here and just stippled it, and that's how I just created a pretty simple and pretty fine cast texture. And once that was allowed to dry, you get a very simple texture, and again you can see the radio mount that again it's included in the kit, and I just glued that in place for, I believe that's probably for the company or battalion net, I'd imagine. So moving on to the hull side, I just added some pretty basic details here. So I just added some missing weld detail using some 0.5mm styrene rod, and again just glue that into place into appropriate area. So here on either side of the applique armor, as well as the missing, or there is a slight seam included in the kit for the glacis, but it's far too soft. So I just took a little bit of stretch sprue, glued it in place, and then ran some extra tin over it. And with my hobby knife, I just sculpted in that weld detail. It might be a bit overscale, however it's far nicer to have it than not to. At least with the 0.5mm, it just looks like a slightly heavy or maybe slightly messy weld. And bear in mind, a lot of these appliques were either field upgrade packs or kind of last minute on the production line, so they're not always going to be the most cleanest of welds when you look at the surviving examples. So you may also notice that I've drilled out the drainage ports on the splash guard and the covers for both the ventilator and fuel caps, and that was just drilled out with a 0.5mm drill bit, or it might be in a 0.3 in this case I believe. Just a nice fine drill bit. I always put a piece of Tamiya tape on the upper surface of that hull so I don't burr the plastic accidentally as I'm trying to drill out those ports. I also added some very simple retaining straps using Tamiya tape for the tools. This is just 1mm wide strips that I just fixed with a bit of super glue, create some basic strap detail, and then just run a little bit of liquid CA glue over them just to lock them all in place and harden them. It's, a bit simple, but it actually looks pretty nice when it's painted up. I also added some retaining chains and detailing to the fuel ports. So these little labels, these photo etch labels, are by Tiger Model Design, and so we have ones for the coolant and fuel, and I also use some PE chain just to add the retaining chains for the fuel filler caps. Pretty simple little detail, but it really does add a lot to the model, and I'm kind of happy I added them, because even though you might not immediately notice them, when you kind of examine the model, I like kind of little details to pop. So moving to the rear of the vehicle, I just added two missing weld seams on either side of the engine deck, again just using 0.5mm styrene rod. And I also added a little bit of cast texturing to the exhausts, even though you can't really see them however it's just a nice little detail. And this again was created using Mr. Surfacer 500, using the exact same method. I just built up a few layers and then just slowly built it up and stippling as I go, just to impart a very simple cast texture. Again, this took about maybe 3 or 4 kind of medium coats, so I'm not trying to be too heavy. It's not the end of the world if you go a bit overboard, because the texture is always going to be quite fine. And I also added some more 3D printed parts from MJ Miniatures, or production should I say, and these are the rear brush guards for the tail lights. Again, some more details here with the engine deck, so you can see more of those fuel labels for the filler caps as well as retaining chains, and also I drilled out again the drainage ports. I kind of skewed one of them a bit too high off the ground, and it's driving me mad now that I can see it close up. But again, these things can happen, and this isn't a competition piece, this is for myself, so I can live with it. But again, just kind of be a bit careful when you are drilling these out, that they are somewhat, try to keep them as low to that weld seam as you can. So moving up to the turret, so I added quite a little bit of detailing to this. So first thing I always do is I add the missing mold seam to the bustle. So that's that large pronounced strip running around the lower quarter of the turret bustle. These turrets were basically cast in large sand molds in real life, and there are a lot of modelers tend to put this as a weld seam, but it's not. It's actually a slight cast seam. So moving to the rotor shield, so I just added some more cast texturing to both the rotor shield and the turret using Mr. Surfacer 500. Now, the images I did find of the Sherbrooke Shermans do have the earlier rotor shield, which is like the thin one. Now that's not glued in place, so I could replace it with the earlier rotor shield, but I kind of like the later production rotor shields that are like the wide ones. So I might replace that with ones that match the photos, but then again, I only found 3 or 4 images I could identify as Sherbrooke's, so it's not really a large sample group. I also added some weld detail again to the applique armour on the cheek of the turret, going to our handy 0.5mm styrene. It's a little bit maybe out of scale in some ways, but I think once we put a bit of paint over it, it should look great. You'll also notice the smoke dispensers or smoke dischargers. Now, I didn't wire them up, and the reason why I didn't is I could not find any really good photographs on Shermans on how they were wired. I found good ones on Churchill's and Matilda's, but I wasn't sure if it was exactly the same configuration, so I just decided to leave it alone. So moving to the rear of the turret bustle, I just added the drainage holes to both the radio mount and the radio pot, as well as the retaining chain for the searchlight cap. And you'll also notice I added foundry markings to the turret roof, again using Archer fine transfers. These are our 3D decals. So moving to the 50 caliber, so we're going for the early mount 50, and just add some very basic details. So just using a little bit of copper wire, I added the missing retaining pins to the cradle mount. So they're just turned into L's, and then I just drill out where they're meant to go on the brackets and just slot them in with a bit of CA glue. And then I just added, again using some PE chain, I just added some of the retaining chains to the 50 mount. So I just glued them basically one to the mount and one to the base of that retaining pin in the cradle. It's a very simple little detail, but it really does add a lot. The rest of the 50 is more or less untouched. The ASUKA model plastic 50s are absolutely gorgeous, so you don't have to do too much to them. The figure who's going to be representing Major Walters is a lovely resin figure by Alpine Miniatures. So he might not have the correct pips on his shoulder for a Major, but I really do like him. Come with 2 heads in the set, so I just used the the head with the Armour Corps helmet. And the reason for that is the beret that comes with the other head option is that of the Royal Tank Regiment, which is an incorrect cap badge for the Sherbrooks. I also added a periscope from Tiger Model Design for the Commander's cupola, which is a beautiful resin piece, highly detailed. And I just added that in, that just slots straight in. And it comes with lovely periscope covers that are actually hollow like the real ones, so they actually fit more accurately. So for the tracks, I quite heretically used Dragon DS tracks I had lying around. So these are T74 like steel cuff tracks, and they fit the Sherman, or they fit the ASUKA model sprockets just fine. I've never had big issues with DS tracks in my own experience, so maybe I might get away with it. There's plenty of T74 tracks out there if you want to use aftermarket ones. I just had these to hand, and hopefully they won't disintegrate. So for the stowage, I used this set from Panzer Art. So these are lovely resin aftermarket stowage sets. And this is for their British Shermans. They have 2 different sets, one for the Firefly and one for standard 75 Shermans. And this is for the 75s. So these are gorgeous with no air bubbles or anything like that. I just give them a quick clean in warm soapy water just to remove any release agent. And then to mount, especially the large stowage set there for the engine deck, what I just did was I took some, I made up some tarps out of epoxy so basically out of like milliput or whatever, and just laid down some tarps. And while the tarps are still wet, I pushed the resin stowage set on top of them, and what that does is that prevents any gaps on the engine deck. So you can kind of see how I have putty tarps underneath that resin on the engine deck, and then that makes it just sit that bit more naturally. You don't have any weird gaps between the resin and the actual plastic. So guys, there you have it. I hope this wasn't too exhaustive and too boring, but this was a really fun. I really enjoyed working on this. I love working on ASUKA model M4s. They're so fun to work with. And with some very basic detailing, even just things like adding cast textures and welds, you can really create some beautiful looking kits. And guys, I hope this kind of proved a little bit useful and give you some ideas by your own Shermans. And do join me when we come to paint this vehicle in the near future. So thank you so much for watching. I have been Shane, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.